Welcome to Hope in the Future with Pastor Ben Foxworth. Check in with us here regularly to hear God's words of instruction and encouragement. And now, here's Pastor Ben.
We were talking about the flood last week, and one of the things that I completely forgot to bring, Miss Linda lent me this book about time, about the timeline of people, and it's written by it wasn't even written by somebody who's known for their faith. It was written by oh my goodness, I forgot what his occupation was, but he wrote this from Adam all the way up until to the modern age. And so there was a question last week about whether or not Adam and Methuselah were on the earth at the same time. And according to this, they were. That lined up. Now Noah wasn't on the same time as Adam, but it's obviously the same time as Methuselah. And Methuselah died at least in the year of the flood, which is what we've talked about. But I thought that was really interesting, and I wanted to make sure that I had mentioned that this week. But let's talk about the flood. What was the purpose of the flood? Why did God flood the earth? It was a do-over. It was like, I remember getting the Atari system in 5th grade. You're playing asteroids, and you can breeze right through those first 7-8 levels just like that. And then, but if you get killed, you're like, I know I can beat them. So then you hit reset. I hope somebody understands what I'm saying. The same with some video games today. Just hit reset. Okay? What else? Purpose of the flood. Did God make a mistake and had to rectify the mistake?
No. It eliminated man and everything that was deviating from God's plan.
Yeah. And really, he just put aside Noah and his family. And Noah he deemed as righteous, right? Does this mean that Noah was perfect and without sin? No, as we found out last week, sadly enough, it's not it. But we do know that Noah walked with God. And Noah, God had decreed, even if Noah couldn't, God had decreed that Noah was righteous. And what we know, what makes us righteous in God's eyes? Faith, exactly. What happened? What does he say with Abraham? We might get to Abraham one of these days. Abraham's his faith was credited as righteousness. In other words, people wonder, have asked me a lot of times, what happens to the people in the Old Testament if they didn't know Jesus, because obviously Jesus, but understand something. God credited his people as righteous because of their faith. Noah is an example of this. What are some of the differences? So we see what happened, the flooding of the earth. Noah and his family are saved with the ark. What are some differences that we see pre versus post flood? What are some of the differences that we talked about that we see in the world after the flood was over and Noah and his family exit the ark?
The way animals treated us.
The way animals
Treated us or reacted to us.
Yep. Okay. Something else with animals too.
Yeah, they make tasty food.
It is now time to eat said animals. And that's probably one of the reasons why they'll be scared of us.
That makes sense. I mean,
yeah, if something's trying to eat me, I usually run. So it's rule of thumb. What else? What are some other differences pre versus post flood?
Shorter lifespans.
Start seeing the lifespan shortening up. As much as I hate saying goodbye to loved ones that the last family member that died. She was 97 years old, and it just, even though she was 97, it just really crushed me when she died. But isn't God a graceful God that He doesn't let us live for hundreds, if not thousands of years? Wasn't God graceful in cutting Adam and Eve off from the tree of life? Because can you imagine living forever in sin? It'd be awful. So yeah, so we start seeing that, and we start seeing the lifespans come down. What did the rainbow mean?
He would never flood it again.
It'll never flood it again, which is a picture of His what?
His covenant with us.
His covenant, His grace, exactly. What is the rainbow an example of today for believer and unbeliever alike? When we as believers of the Word see a rainbow, what do we think of, or should think of?
God's promise.
Think of God. So even the lost, even people that do not call upon the name of the Lord, see the rainbow and are benefiting of that common grace that God is extending with this promise not to flood the earth. So that rainbow means that God will never be mad again. Right?
Look at what the rainbow.
Not in my lifetime.
No. The rainbow is about specifically the flood and God's grace in that. There is going to come a time when God's patience again will end and His wrath will be experienced. So we are talking, this is a characters Bible study, and the thing that I've always loved as I've worked on this over the years is the concept that God would take an imperfect schlub like me and say that He would use me for His perfect will. Does that overwhelm anybody? That the creator of the universe, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God that made everybody, said, you know what? Mike, I'm going to use you. Judy, I'm going to use you. Isn't that incredible? And so really, even though we're talking about these people, I want us to understand that this is God's story. The Word of God is about God. It's about His gospel for those who are perishing, and we were perishing, but as believers, we trusted in the gospel. But it is also about the men and women who were not necessarily believers. Noah, of course, is one of the icons, especially of the Old Testament. Even though he was flawed, even though he was not perfect, and even though the last account that we see with him was kind of sketchy and sad, the fact of the matter is that we consider him one of the good guys, do we not? As much as we can consider good guys. But then we have the villains. Now, if you have any time of conversation with me and my love of movies, I will bore you to tears with my love of movies. And understand, my movie knowledge isn't just going back to the Avengers. I love movies going all the way back to the Silent Age. I love the way that stories are told with film. And one of my favorite things about the way stories are told with film is how bad guys are in the movies. Who can think of a bad guy in a movie? Give me a bad guy.
Well, you want James Bond bad guy? You want
Any
Western
bad guy.
guys?
Yeah.
The Joker.
The Joker.
Yeah.
Hans Gruber. Goldfinger.
I
Dr.
was
No.
thinking of, I'm trying to think of the tribe in, Jeremiah Johnson, the Indians that
Oh,
come up
yes.
all the time. So.
Yes. Great movie. Great movie. Who hasn't seen Jeremiah Johnson? Because we got to remedy that if you haven't.
Oh, that's a cultural deficiency.
Great.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the bad guy. So we talked about a bad guy, even though, remember, all of us are bad guys in God's story. It's the gospel that makes us one with Him. But what was the first bad guy that we talked about?
Ham.
Satan.
Oh, you mean
The first.
pre-Noah or after Noah?
Pre-Noah.
Oh, pre-Noah, yeah.
Cain.
Cain, that's right.
Yeah.
Cain. And then we see the legacy of Cain. So we see Noah, and we see what happened with after the flood with
With Ham.
Ham. And then we're going to see, just like with Cain, and 7 generations after Adam through Cain's line, we have that guy named Lamech. And you remember Lamech's thing about how he was bragging about the people that he's killed? Well, now we're going to see that. It's not going to take 7 generations. It's pretty much a direct descendant of Ham, who was cursed by Noah, if you remember last week. We're going to see a real bad guy. As we talk about these characters in the Bible and what they mean in God's story, I'm exclusively talking about the people that God has made. I'm not talking about the angels, and I'm not going to talk about Satan. We'll get into Satan a little bit, especially as we get into the account of Job. But ultimately, I'm not going to give Satan a whole week or two of subject. He doesn't deserve that, does he?
No.
So, but tonight, we see somebody who is, I think that if we're not careful, we can really gloss over a true villain. And the reason he's a true villain is because he completely, not only just turned away from God, but openly defied God and did everything he could to bring people with him in his defiance of God. Mike Larkin, tell me about that shirt. Was it a shirt you said you saw?
Yeah,
Tell me about that shirt again.
well, it was, whoever designed it, it was pretty cool how it was designed, but it basically said something about that they loved God, but I'm not a Christian. You know, I love God, but I'm not a Christian. So it's like, struck me instantly as like, they're acknowledging Christ in that statement. Why would you even say that? You know what I'm saying? If you love God, you love God, or if you love Jesus, you love Jesus, or whatever. But they're specifically denying Christ in their little statement there.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Exactly. We're going to talk about, that has something to do with what we're talking about. I didn't just say that. The idea of blatantly, intentionally, and purposefully turning your face away from God and what this means. So Genesis is essentially 2 books. Does anybody know how Genesis is divided? It's basically 2 books into one.
You're talking about repentance.
No, just the book of Genesis. Was that mine? Everybody.
That's mine.
Okay.
Sound like you had an epiphany over there.
Yeah. That would be awesome if everybody had those. And you can really tell if you're like breaking through.
Can I ask a little question?
Yes.
Sorry. How is it possible that Noah can curse one of his sons when he's just born himself? I don't understand that.
That's a great question. God had put Noah in charge of everything. He was essentially given all of the responsibilities that he gave Adam at this point. And then when he did that, when he did what he did, when he sinned, if you will, and then brings Ham into it, he has no choice but to make sure that Ham knows your actions, even though my actions were just as bad, your actions are hideous too, and this is the result that it's going to be. This curse was really from God, because
God told Noah, or,
we could say that that came from God,
okay.
because as we see, the Canaanites, which are the descendants of Ham, are the pain in the Israelite side. So yeah.
Was he a
But ultimately, like, if I get upset and I say, you know what, Lori, I curse you. I don't have that.
Right.
I don't have that.
Yeah.
God has not put me in a place where I can do that or say that. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It's more for prophetic.
Yeah, exactly. And it wasn't that Noah had any power to put a curse on him. it's more of like what Mike just said, it's more of a prophetic statement, and then it really was God that essentially just let Ham and his descendants be who they are. That it wasn't really that they were turned into bad people for this. Basically, this is just who you people are.
Is that the same with when they would give a blessing?
Well, there's a few different versions of a blessing, but yeah. But it's not, again, like it's not anything that has been bestowed as a special power of God that I can bless you or curse you in the way that God can. I can say these things. So like
Like when Jacob died and everyone came up blessing and not like the others.
yeah, but it's Jacob. It's Jacob basically giving the final assessment to his sons about what they have been to him. And it just happens to be that it's because it's God's people, the Israelites. That's why it has. I mean, I could give a blessing or quote unquote a curse to my kids. It's not going to be necessarily how it is. As a matter of fact, both my kids are doing so much better than I ever would have thought they would have been doing, and they both do wonderful. I don't know if that sounded kind of mean, but that's not how it wasn't how it's supposed to come out. But but I won't tell you that it was because of my blessing that they did that. But I'll say that God has definitely used that in them as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Perfect.
Pastor,
Yes, ma'am.
asked the question. In my Bible, it says, the first part is concerned with the early history of mankind, chapters 1 through 11. The second part deals with the history of a specific people whom God chose as his own,
Exactly.
12 through 50.
Exactly. Part 1 of Genesis is about the fall of man. It's about the creation of the world, specifically God's jewel of his creation, which was humanity. God created man and woman for fellowship. But man and woman, humanity, turns away from God. That's what the fall is about. The second part is about, as God focuses right down on one family, specifically one man by the name of Abraham, and how Abraham became the father of a great nation, Israel, which of course it all plays out so wonderfully. But tonight we are ending that first part of Genesis as we talk about the end of the fall. And just to remind everybody where we're at, the fall was when Adam and Eve sinned, were taken out of paradise lost, if you will, taken out of the garden. As men began to populate, and as I said earlier, humanity will always turn its face away from God, and sure enough they did. God, of course, at that point said, what did Mr. Ed say? Do over, reboot. And then of course last week as we ended, we talked about Ham and Noah. Noah fails to govern himself. Sin continues to go downward. And Genesis chapter 9 verse 1, there was a commandment that God gave Noah. What was that commandment in Genesis 9:1?
Multiply.
Be fruitful and multiply upon the earth. Fill the earth. And tonight we're going to talk about Babel, or the early days of Babylon. What is your favorite? I want you to think about a technological advance, and I don't care what it is. Just think about like the days of Genesis here. What is something, whether it's technology, whether it's some kind of discovery or invention, what is something that is like your favorite? What is your, like for example, the internet. The internet is like, people love the internet, And the internet is awesome because through the internet you can put the gospel out like no other generation ever in the history of humanity has ever been able to do. The internet is awesome, and I would imagine all of us in here are connected with the internet in some way. Am I right? Is there anybody here that is not? Because part of me wants to salute you. We're all part of the internet. I know because I've gotten emails from many of you. But what's the downside of the internet? Is that we see degradation into our living rooms that we have never seen before either. So that's an example. What is your favorite technological advancement in humanity?
Cameras.
Cameras. Now, what's a downside to that? Well, first of all, why do you like the cameras?
Pictures of my kids.
Yeah, memories that you can have. Yep, exactly.
Does modern heating count?
Modern eating. Heating, yeah, it
When I
counts.
was growing up,
Oh,
we
yeah,
had
warm water indoors.
Yeah.
We only had heat in one room.
Yeah.
And when we didn't get central heating till I was probably in seventh grade,
Mhm.
it was the most wonderful thing, and I still think it's wonderful.
I'm like that, but kind of the opposite. Air conditioning for me. Yeah. Refrigerators. Let's go back to the cameras for a second. And the heaters. What's a downside to the cameras? What is something, though, that even though we've discovered this really cool technology, that we were able to do that, what is a downside to cameras?
There's a good side and a bad side to them. I mean, you can take pictures of good things, or you can take pictures of bad things, videotape things.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, I kind of get.
Get caught stealing a cookie or something like that.
Oh yeah, it can record our sin in a way that nobody ever did. Yeah. Okay.
Actually, the downside is you're wanting to take a picture of all of this, but you can only get this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true.
And if you do have a panoramic camera, it shrinks it down so much that all the detail that you visually see is not going to be able to get into that photo.
One time when Callie and I were in Nashville, the moon, I had never seen the moon like it was on this Sunday night in June of 2013. The moon was incredible. And I took pictures, I tried to play with the filter, took all these pictures, and then when you look at my phone, why am I taking a picture of a distant moon for? It didn't capture what I was able to see with my eyes.
Just a pet peeve that I have, when I see something happening in the news or event, and everybody's up there with their cameras,
Right.
their cell phones, and I had read somewhere, one of the psychological magazines in my studies, when people rely on that for their memory as opposed to what God has given us, it's an incomplete memory.
Yeah.
It's missing because, they just take a picture, we have sight, sound, we have smells, everything is combined in. When you see it and you pay attention to it with your given senses, a camera is just a flat piece of, I didn't come out like I wanted to.
Yeah, that's actually a great point. Yeah.
And you're not living in the moment. If you're so busy capturing photos,
Yes.
you're not really living in the moment. Like
No.
now you see all these people at concerts holding these things, they're not really listening to the music, they're not really soaking it in, they're not feeling it because they're so worried about being
Making
able
sure
to
that they're
upload it to
shot.
Snapchat.
Yep.
Yeah, there's that emotional component to any memory that you've got,
Yeah.
and like you said, it just distracts you because you're trying to do something. Yeah.
There was, in the news, I think it was yesterday or the day before, some young lady was getting assaulted on either subway or a train or something like that, and everybody had their cameras out filming it versus helping her.
Yeah.
Just being ready.
Yeah.
So what we're going to see tonight is we're going to see that just because people can do things, and just because that there is advancements, if we don't have a mindset of a Christian worldview, how easily corrupted those can be. When the guy that made the printing press, Gutenberg, thank you. When he made the printing press, I doubt he had any concept that there would be a man named Hugh Hefner one day who would totally take his idea of printing out stuff into a different direction. Because Gutenberg created the printing press for the Bible. And so it just goes to show you that man will corrupt whatever it is that we can think of to do. And tonight we're going to see that everything from our plans to our very self-esteem must be rooted in God. And if not, we may succeed in the moment. We see all the time. I mean, all you got to do is turn on your television and see there are people who hate God that are doing very well for themselves. They may succeed in the moment, but they will lose the end game. Ultimately, we are to let God do His will, and if we follow His lead, we'll see the success that He has for us. Now, when I think of, as we go through Genesis, and I've talked a lot about, growing up in Sunday school and in VBS and hearing a lot of these accounts and how they kind of became a little bit of a mythology. They kind of became just like these kind of really biblical sci-fi stories that had a nice message to it. Do you know what I mean? That sometimes we tend to diminish, for example, what we're going to talk about tonight with the Tower of Babel. Because the way that I understood it growing up is that everybody said, hey, let's just build a tower and go up to God. Well, that sounds like that. I mean, it's not a well thought out idea. They didn't know any better, and then God had to say, don't do that. But isn't that okay that they at least wanted to build a tower that took them into outer space? But that's not what the account of Babel is all about. It is not a tower to outer space. And when we tend to take these stories and turn them into just mythological morality stories, we make them forgettable. And what we are seeing tonight is a pivotal part of God's story in the Bible. Because man is sinful, because we want to corrupt everything, we are prone to forget the things that we're supposed to remember. And so here God flooded the earth. And barely a few generations later, we're seeing that already they are not just forgetting, but intentionally forgetting the lessons that was learned with the flood. Also want to see tonight, I feel like the preface is taking up all our time, is we see all of the, ever since there has been a media, ever since there has been governments, it has always been a struggle between collectivists and individualists. What do we call that here in our country? Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal, socialist, capitalist, whatever. It has always been this struggle since the days of Genesis. This concept of a collectivism versus individualism. Now, I'm not trying to get on a political rant, but this is just a fact of the matter. That God's directions, Genesis 9:1, was to, Matt said it earlier, populate. And how are you going to populate and fill the earth? Spread out. That this is what God had designed for His people. This is what He said that He wanted His people to do, was to do this. But here, what we're going to begin to read tonight is instead of doing that, they want to come together. You remember in Cain when God told Cain after he killed Abel, what did He tell Cain to do? What was
To wander.
to wander the earth. And what did Cain end up doing? Built a city. It's the same thing that's happening here. Come together versus spread out. It's always been the same fight. Are we insects? When you think of an insect, you think of an ant colony. And what's in charge of the ant colony? Or a beehive? You got a queen. And then everybody, all the ants and the bees, what are they doing?
Working for the bee.
They're in service of the bee, right? There is no individuality amongst the bees and the ants. That they know their role, they will die for their role, and their role is just to keep the queen, and even the queen's role is also one that just changes, because eventually she dies and new queens need to be put in. Or is that how God has created man? That we are to just be one collective serving one larger human being? Is that how God has created us?
No.
Absolutely not. Are we going to behave as insects? Are we going to behave as the people that God has created us and has called us to be? Satan's plan, and all you've got to do is look at how things are happening, and my goodness, are they happening so quick? Did you ever think that some of the things that we're seeing 2 years ago, just a measly 2 years ago, we always knew some of these things would be happening, but my goodness, 2 years is a pretty short time, isn't it? And some of the things that we're seeing, it's crazy. Satan's plan is to remove individuality and to get humanity to question creation. That is Satan's plan, is to remove all of our individuality and to get us to question creation. Any thoughts on that? Anything that, do you see that? Do you kind of see that that's happening? You see that's happening when we're being told now that there is no such a thing as that we reject biology and say that a man can be whatever a man wants to be, a woman can be whatever a woman wants to be. They don't even have to be either. I can't remember the designation of somebody that's neither male nor female, but that's just an example. We can completely do whatever it is we want, but ultimately, we're all falling under the same spell of the humanism that is trying to have its way. When you think of the Antichrist, what do you think of? You're like, wow, how did we get to Antichrist? So we'll get there. What do you think of when you think of the Antichrist? The end of time. Okay.
With all the surrounding government of the Antichrist. Everything's under the control of the Antichrist. And the minions that are in there with it.
The Antichrist is the queen bee,
Yeah.
right?
Everything's underneath that, and the restrictions that they put on people, if there's an indication of where you've lost your individualism, that would be the extreme case that you're no longer an individual.
Exactly.
You're a piece of chattel to serve the greater cause. I'm not going to say good, the greater cause.
Yeah, because there is no such thing as good. Yeah.
I think it's like a million little things combined.
Mm-hmm.
Taking the crowd out of school, telling people they don't have a right to say no, to inject their bodies with stuff, to try to make it a cashless society, to say that there are more than two genders, to encourage in 6th grade that creation is not a thing.
Mm-hmm.
That, they don't teach creation in school, they only teach evolution.
Mm-hmm.
I think all of that is a combination of, and many, many, many more things, a combination of the Antichrist.
Are you looking at characteristics of what we might think, or?
Really, just whatever you might think. If I had a chalkboard, I would be doing what I always just do as a word cloud, just writing down your thoughts on what, when you hear the word Antichrist, what do you think of? Whether it be characteristics, whether it be something that you remember reading in the Word, maybe something that you've seen on the news, maybe some of you are thinking of the Omen movie. I don't know.
Yeah, I think one of the words that I think people seem to throw around quite a bit, because with what Matt was saying, you're kind of uniting everything.
Mm-hmm.
So that, I would think the main thing for that is charisma, maybe charismatic.
Yeah.
To be able to influence, everyone to bend their way.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad you brought up the word unity. Because,
Oh, did I say unity?
did you not say unity? You said unite, you said unite.
Yeah, well, if he's gonna unite.
That's when
Matt
it
was
just,
saying.
everything's under his control. And, you know, maybe unity wouldn't be right, but by golly, you're all part of that group that's under that control. And if you're not towing the line, you don't exist anymore. And nowadays, our comparison to that right now, to me, is the woke culture. If you're not towing the line of the community,
It's religious.
yeah, we'll just.
They're very religious, are they not? Yeah. The Antichrist is called Satan's man of sin. Let me read for you in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 3 through 10. Do not let anyone deceive you in any way, for that day will not come unless the apostasy comes first and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the man doomed to destruction. He opposes and exalts himself above every so-called God or object of worship, so that he sits in God's temple, proclaiming that he himself is God. Don't you remember that when I was still with you, I used to tell you about this? And you know what currently restrains him, so that he will be revealed in his time. For the mystery of lawlessness is already at work, but the one now restraining will do so until he is out of the way, and then the lawless one will be revealed. The Lord Jesus will destroy him with the breath of his mouth, and will bring him to nothing at the appearance of his coming. The coming of the lawless one is based on Satan's working with every kind of miracle, both signs and wonders serving the lie, and with every wicked deception among those who are perishing. They perish because they did not accept the love of the truth, and so be saved. Why are we talking about the Antichrist? Anybody have any questions?
Because of us.
Because what we're seeing tonight is where we're at?
Yeah, and it's the need for individuality. It's the need to exalt ourselves over somebody else or over God. We're not no longer working together. It's all about division.
And hold on to that thought, because that's good. Because tonight we're talking about a guy by the name of Nimrod. We're going to be looking at Nimrod's story. Let's first of all look at where we first see Nimrod. Open your Bibles to Genesis chapter 10. Can I get somebody to read verses 8 through 12 of Genesis chapter 10?
Cush fathered Nimrod. He was the first on earth to be a mighty man. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh, in the land of Shinar.
Okay. So Nimrod had a few different names. He is recorded in world history. He had another name of Sargon. But Nimrod was his Hebrew name. And his Hebrew name, the name Nimrod is to rebel, or to gather to rebel. But that's what the name Nimrod means. Now Nimrod, the way we see the description, is that he is a man's man. It talks about him as a hunter. Hold on to that thought. Why? But it's interesting, because when you think of Nimrod nowadays, you think of it as a kind of a mistake. He's such a Nimrod. Now, Jay Gunner cannot answer this question because he knows the answer to this. Does anybody know where the name Nimrod as an insult came from? Anybody want to venture a guess? This is fascinating trivia. Bugs Bunny! It was a Bugs Bunny cartoon with Elmer Fudd, and Nimrod was always a name for a hunter, and so Bugs Bunny was calling Elmer Fudd Nimrod, and that actually just kind of settled into the culture as a put down. So when you hear me talk about, oh my goodness, Larkin is such a Nimrod. I've been watching Bugs Bunny. It's also kind of funny because Nimrod was obsessed with his name. And isn't it kind of funny? Maybe a little bit of a wink from God that here in the year 2021 that the name Nimrod is a name that means ridiculous idiot. That's just kind of
I was just telling Ed of another little piece of trivia with the name of Nimrod. It was the British military, their anti-submarine aircraft has the nickname of Nimrod.
Oh,
a
wow.
mighty hunter.
Yeah.
So it's out over the ocean, hunting for Soviet era ships and stuff like that, and they were called Nimrod. So,
Was that World War II or?
no, this is Cold War time.
Oh, Cold War time.
Yeah, so obviously those folks didn't watch Bugs Bunny.
Bugs Bunny hadn't settled in with
But somebody had read their Bible and they
Yeah.
said Nimrod was a mighty hunter. So
Yes.
Yeah.
That is interesting. Let's talk about the word mighty for a second, because it does use the word mighty, but understand something. Because that the word mighty also is a word that means tyrant. So, when it talks about how Nimrod was mighty, there's also this understanding of an edge of tyranny that he has. And the idea of a mighty hunter was a tyrant hunter, which the insinuation that they understood in the Old Testament and in the early church is that it wasn't that Nimrod knew how to go out and bag a good deer. What do you think that it meant as a hunter? He hunted men. He hunted people. Nimrod, which was the belief of the people that read the Bible, or read the scriptures back then, that he was a mighty tyrant. He hunted men. Now understand, this is interesting because it happens right before God is going to introduce us to a guy by the name of Abram. Because Nimrod, as we look at it, is Satan's attempt at creating his own Abraham. As a matter of fact, Nimrod has been described many times as a prototype of the Antichrist. Just some of the things that we've already seen, and there, and his name, which we already talked about, the purpose of his name, rebel or to gather in rebellion. His rebellion was to form a great unification project against God. He was there's of course all the Babylonian references, the references of him as a potential hunter of men. And what was his goal was to make a name for himself. To make a name. To take away, God had... Remember what we learned with Adam, is that with authority, naming comes from a place of authority. And here, Nimrod is saying, we are to make a name for ourselves, usurping the authority of God. But the idea that this man who we call a mighty hunter, and we name some of our ships after it, but actually was more akin to a violent tyrant. He was also a motivated empire builder. Now, one of the other things it says that it was before the Lord. It says he was a powerful hunter in the sight of the Lord. It is easy to look at that and say, oh, that God blessed that. But that is a neutral phrase, before the Lord. As a matter of fact, there's a sense of defiance to it. That he is doing this before the Lord. If you want to look back in Genesis chapter 6, verse 11. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with wickedness. So I'm a flawed person. I don't know why I put that reference down.
Well,
It's going to come.
what you were saying is before the Lord, and whatever translation you're reading, mine had, what it was, I've lost my spot now.
Yes.
Anyway, it had before God, which was as opposed to the translation you read.
Verse 9.
Verse 9?
10:9.
Genesis
Yeah.
6:11
No,
and
just
10.
man, perfect vision. Oh, no, and no, that's not it.
And then the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with
Yeah, before God, actually.
Yeah, before God. Okay. Yeah, so it's the same, it's that same, thank you so much, Matt. This is collaborative, guys. This is, I'm flawed.
It's kind of like in Kings, I mean, when you go through Kings,
Mhm.
over and over, the Kings in the, you know, in the side of the Lord, that, you know, the things that they
They're
did.
wicked in
Yeah, yeah, so
Mhm.
he's seeing it, and it's not, oh, well, that's.
Good or bad.
Yeah, he's doing this right before God.
Right, yeah.
Yep, exactly. Daniel chapter 11, verses 36 to 39. I do have a note on why I wrote this down. Talks about the type of Antichrist here. Then the king will do whatever he wants. He will exalt and magnify himself above every god, and he will say outrageous things against the God of gods. He will be successful until the time of wrath is completed, because what has been decreed will be accomplished. He will not show regard for the gods of his fathers, the God desired by women, or for any other god, because he will magnify himself above all. Instead, he will honor a God of fortresses, a God his fathers did not know, with gold, silver, precious stones, and riches. He will deal with the strongest fortresses with the help of a foreign god. He will greatly honor those who acknowledge him, making them rulers over many and distributing land as a reward.
What was that?
That is Daniel chapter 11, verses 36 through 39, talking about the Antichrist, or the type of Antichrist, which we see again with Nimrod. As I read 2 Thessalonians earlier on, we see that the Antichrist has the pride of man, which Nimrod displays. He opposes and exalts himself above every so-called God or object of worship, so that he sits in God's temple, proclaiming that he himself is God. His kingdom is a city called Babel. It's a kingdom of confusion. It's interesting that that word has been co-opted. When we hear the word Babel nowadays, what do we think of? A language program, which is intentional. Yeah, just people just saying words that nobody can understand. What was and is God's desire for us together? What is God's desire for us as his people?
Worship him.
To worship him. And one of the things that we see a lot is for us to do it together. That there was never this design by God that Dave would become a Christian and then have to go live by himself and never have to encounter another human being again in order to keep his relationship right with God. So we've been talking about the church on Sundays. This is a good example. God wanted his people to be together. But unity with a sinister purpose is not good. If you were to ask, I remember being a teenager in the 80s and hearing all of my fellow teenagers, what is your wish? And they would say, world peace. Which I remember thinking at the time, you're lying, you want something cool. But what is, as we were talking about the downsides of technology, what would be the downside of world peace?
I would be out of a job.
You'd be out of a job. Yes.
Total conformity.
Yes, exactly. Conformity, and eventually unity isn't unity, it becomes unification. Can I get somebody to read Genesis chapter 11, verses 1 through 9? And I will breeze through this for you all.
Ben,
Yes.
if you had world peace, everybody they would not be worshiping God.
Exactly.
Yeah. Because they'd be worshiping everyone instead of worshiping God.
Because eventually, to get to a place of world peace, you would have to have people turn away from their beliefs to all come together with one sterilized belief system. Can I get somebody to read verses 1 through 9 of Genesis 11?
At what time the whole earth had the same language and vocabulary. As people migrated from the east, they found a valley in the land of Shinar and settled there. They said to each other, "Come, let us make oven-fired bricks." They had brick for stone and asphalt for mortar. And they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower with its top in the sky. Let us make a name for ourselves, otherwise we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth. And until when? 9?
Yes.
Then the Lord came down to look over the city and the tower that the men were building. The Lord said, if as one people, all having the same language, they have begun to do this, then nothing they find to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down there and confuse their language, so that they will not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them from there over the face of the whole earth, and they stopped building the city. Therefore, its name is called Babylon, for there the Lord confused the language of the whole earth. And from there the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth.
All right. Verse 3 talks about, come, let us make oven-fired bricks. Now here's what's interesting about this area. Archaeologists have found bricks that the mortar used to make bricks and how they made bricks. Because this area that we're talking about is a plain, meaning what? It's flat, which means there's not a lot of stone, not a lot of rocks. So what they're doing is that they're having to make these bricks. They're making their bricks with their own hand, signifying, as they're saying this, that they're creating something. There is creation in their mindset that what they're doing. And then in verse 4 we see, they said, come, let us build a city and a tower with its top in the sky. Let us make a name for ourselves, otherwise we'll be scattered over the face of the whole earth. So has anybody ever seen Lord of the Rings, the Lord of the Rings trilogy? If you've seen the Lord of the Rings trilogy, you remember the towers? I don't remember the names, I'm not that nerdy. But, yeah. So, he's always right there, yeah. But
You wanna know what they are?
yeah, go ahead, tell the names.
Minas Tirith and Minas Morgul.
Thank you, Ed. So,
I'm not ashamed.
So you remember, I mean, the idea was and these towers that were being built at this time were a lot like that. And what these towers were is they were temples of worship, essentially. Not worship of gods per se, but what they have found out is that they would basically worship stars, the moon, weather patterns. That we see that they were paying a lot of attention in these towers to that. So it's not just about building this giant tower. These towers were basically temples of godlessness that they're building. And they are defiant of the Lord's command. They want their achievement to reflect their own immortality as a people who have come together. And their name is going to be the memorial to all of the mighty honor that they are wanting to bestow upon themselves. They want their name glorified. Now let me ask you a question. Do we do this today?
Yeah.
How do we do that today? What are some examples of what we do today? And I'm not just talking about, if I'm trying to sell a peanut brittle, I want to get my brand name out there. I'm not talking about whether or not you want to create a brand, but what is a way that we want to glorify our own names?
We put a star on the Walk of Stars in Hollywood.
Yes. Okay, yeah.
Although on that same line, we have a star named after, whatever.
Yeah, I think if I pay $30, for a birthday gift for you, I can name a star.
I think people compete too, to have their name, have their achievements and their success, and so people know them and acknowledge them.
Let me ask you this question. Do we do this in the church today? How do we do so in the church?
Well, where do you see like a pew with somebody's name on it or a Bible dedicated?
Yes, actually, yes.
Family pew.
Plaques
Family
on all.
pew or like, Bible is dedicated or donated by.
Yeah. We want the name. Like, there is a church, I will not say the name of the church. I don't want to create a whole bunch of ridiculous controversy. But I was shocked a few years ago that people were starting to put the signs of this church in their yard. It was like like those campaign signs, except it was the name of this church. Didn't say one thing about Jesus, didn't say one thing about God, didn't say one thing about anything other than the name of this church and how they are a faithful member of this church. There's a problem with that, isn't there? Why is that a potential red flag?
But they're just trying to show off. They just want you to know, or the people passing by, that they're a faithful member. They might not be.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
Priorities are just wrong.
Yeah, and that's it. Is they're glorifying this
Building or instead of God.
the establishment, exactly, than what the establishment's about. When you jump ahead to Genesis chapter 12, verse 2. I will make you into a great nation, I will bless you. And then what's the next thing God says to Abram? Make you famous, I will make your name great. You will be a blessing.
That's a lot different than
But
us, we, us, that we just read.
Yeah.
You know, it was all about them and their doing of all that.
Yeah.
this is God doing this. This
Yeah.
isn't Abram himself going up.
Yeah, there's a big difference between me saying I'm great and God saying.
Bingo.
Yeah.
Exactly. I don't promote myself. The boss has to promote me. Yeah. What's the difference? I've been saying it a couple times now. I've said it a few times on Sunday. What's the difference between unite and unify? What's the difference between unity and unification? Individuality. Explain.
Okay, say the word again.
Unity.
Unity, okay. Coming together and each person has their own individuality. They're all a different part of, like when the Bible says, we're all one body, but each person has a different part.
Yep. Exactly.
And unification is when everybody's just the same.
Exactly. Exactly. So I'm looking at this group right now. Everybody look around at each other. I don't even know all of your stories yet, but I do know, just from how little I know, that you all are quite different from each other. But together, yes.
It's a blessing.
It's some of you, I'm glad there's only one of you. So
There are those who fall far from the apple and they should not have.
yes. But the fact is that if God, as the church, as God has equipped us together, can we be a powerful, Holy Spirit-led church for Him, even though we're all different from each other? Yeah. Absolutely, we can. Because just like Miss Lori talked about, the Bible uses the analogy of the body a lot. These people here in Genesis 11, they want to be a strong nation. They want to be a strong empire. But the concern was, if they scatter, the power wouldn't be there. Now this is where I'm going to kind of get a little bit dangerously close to politics, but I need you to understand that I'm not trying to get to a political place, but understand something. When people say that you can't go away, that you need to stay in this area because, for whatever reason, that's kind of what's happening here. The people of Babel didn't want people to go out, because if people went out, they would lose their power. The only way they're going to get their power is if they come together as one unified people. Does that make sense? Or I should say, I don't want to ask that question. I should say, are you understanding what I'm saying?
It's kind of hard to be the most powerful person if you're the only one in the area.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Individuality threatens these tyrants here. We see these examples today. In verse 5, though, I want you to notice the Lord's description. Then the Lord came down to look over the city and the tower that the men were building. It's an anthropomorphic picture of the Lord coming down, look over the city, just like the garden, just like what we see in the garden. Understand something. What's being communicated here is that God is not unaware. God's not coming down to Babel and saying, hey, what you guys doing? God is not unaware. His actions here show he is taking control. He's been watching. Probably heartbroken. Now he must intercede. He just got done flooding the earth. And here, like I said, very few generations later, he's already having to intercede. So maybe God's saying, okay, I didn't say I said I wouldn't flood the earth. What if I just start doing volcanoes everywhere? Well, obviously, God could do that. God can continue to find different ways to destroy the world and to bring it back again. But that's not God's plan. That's not God's plan for people. Verse 6. Now this one, people can trip over this. The Lord said, if they've begun to do this as one people, having all the same language, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Wow, because these people in Babel, Nimrod and his kingdom, they said that they will be as powerful as God. Is God worried that they will be as powerful as he? What does God mean when he says nothing will be impossible for them? It's a dismay. It's a dismay that left to their own devices, they will forget God. That they might build this tower, they might build this empire, and it'll just keep getting worse and worse, just like before the flood. This is not God's plan, because he wants mankind to spread it. So in verse 7, he says, come, let us go down there and confuse their language, so they will not understand one another's speech. Us being the fullness of God. And do you ever think about the power of language? Understand something. As humans, we are created people. What are some of the things that we've talked about that put us different than the rest of the animal kingdom? We have the breath of God within us. That God created humanity specifically. We are different, and one of the things that are different is that we can communicate. We have the power of language. Now, my dogs communicate with each other. They don't have language. You could see animals communicating even from different breeds. They don't have language. We have been given a gift of language, and not even just verbal language. The fact that we can write, the fact that we can communicate the way we do. This is a powerful gift that God has given to us. Have you ever wondered why we have the gift of language? Have you ever wondered why we have the ability to have language?
So we can spread the word.
So we can spread the word, exactly. So we can worship him and understand what we're worshiping. So again, God could have just come down and said, that's the sound of a squash. It didn't come out the way I wanted it to.
You didn't communicate.
I didn't communicate with squash very well. I didn't speak in tongues. So he could have done that, but he didn't. Because even in God's punitive actions here, just like he has been, God is going to show grace. And he does it by using one of these interesting little, remember what I said when we started this Bible study about how sometimes the writer of Genesis that we know as Abraham uses a lot of wordplay. And so one of the things here, it says here in verse 7, is, come, let us go down there and confuse their language so they will not understand one another's speech. So he takes the Hebrew word for brick. Is basically the best way describe it is it was, you look at it with the consonants, LBN. And the word that God uses here with confusion is the word brick backwards. Man's bricks cannot overcome God. He turns it backwards and creates confusion for them. Verses 8 and 9. So from there the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth, and they stopped building the city. Therefore, its name is called Babylon, for there the Lord confused the language of the whole earth, and from there the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. I always talk about God is not a God of confusion. So does this go against that? Because the Bible's very clear, God creates confusion here. Now, because in this momentary confusion, there is order that God has restored. Because people are going to use the language that God has given them the ability to use to do everything they can to shut him out. And so, he just makes that right by confusing the languages. Zephaniah chapter 3 verse 9 gives us a little bit of a future though. For I will then restore pure speech to the people so that all of them may call on the name of the Lord and serve him with a single purpose. Again, when God created humanity, he wanted humanity to worship him. He wanted to have this experience with humanity, not experience is not the word, fellowship with humanity. But we messed that up too. But then we jump to Acts, and this is the last point, then I'm going to let you all go. Acts chapter 2. Go ahead and open your Bible to Acts. Thanks for staying with me. I'm going a little long tonight. Acts chapter 2, verses 1 through 12, which we've been talking about on Sunday mornings, we see that the early church coming together. Now, what happens when the Holy Spirit hits that room in Acts chapter 2? There are people at this time, people are coming from all over the known world for worship in Jerusalem. They are coming from different parts of the world, which means that they do not understand each other's languages. And so when these people come into this room where the disciples are at, as the Holy Spirit hits, what happens?
They all hear in their own language.
They hear the gospel in their own language. Does this reverse what happened at Babel? No. But it is showing us that there is a future for us. That there will be a day when all of God's people will say amen in the same tongue. That we will truly be worshiping together. Satan is defeated. There's no more word on Nimrod. Nimrod's not really known too much after this. But humanity seems like it's constantly on this suicide course. Like I said, God has already promised this prohibition on floods. What's going to happen? This is where we go into the next part of Genesis. The end of 11, the end of chapter 11 of Genesis, we're going to meet some new characters. And as we meet these new characters, we're going to see where God's plan for his people will be given. Ultimately, God is building a great nation. And ultimately, will produce the one that will make a way for man and God to be united.